There's something about sketching that fills me with so much joy. It's almost hard to explain where that comes from, but it definitely connects me back to childhood. It's this primitive feeling of taking these ideas and putting them directly on a sheet of paper. It's almost meditative in qualities, and there's a lot of thought that takes place while you're doing it, but it almost comes from deep within as you feel the pen just glide across a sketchbook or a canvas. It's something that I dedicated my life to as a kid because it was so enjoyable just thinking about how do I take inspiration from these other designers who are masters of form. And as a kid, I was mostly looking at automotive designers of the 1960s and the 50s who did these brilliant, beautiful, artistic drawings of basically pure sculpture on art. And as a kid, I thought that was such a cool, interesting thing that was actually a job. I mean, it really was so intriguing to me because it was this great fusion of art. I mean, pure art, pure form development and creation, and the same sort of thinking about how light touches a surface that you would see on a Greek sculpture of the ancient times, and seeing how designers of that era were able to translate those sorts of thoughts first into a sheet of paper and then to a clay model. And it was so intriguing to me, and I've never quite reached that level, of course, but it's the idea of striving for that similarity, of trying to think what they were thinking as they thought of this idea in their head and they put it directly on paper. Those designers and designers of today that are incredibly inspirational, I'm still striving for that. And that's what makes it fun. It is a difficult thing to accomplish. Anything that you see designed out there is probably designed by someone who really went through a ton of training and a ton of practice in whatever medium of creation that they had. And it is fun to try to achieve that and to try to think, how did they get there? How did they sketch that? How did they think through that form? And it's a journey. You're not going to hit it immediately, which is part of the fun. And I followed that desire as a kid because it just filled me with pure joy. And still to this day, anytime that I pick up a pen and just start to think about whatever it might be that's in my head and put it directly on the sheet and think about how that might then become a sculpture, and how can I make it as beautiful as possible in this state that would then translate into a beautiful, beautiful product or piece of art. I still find that joy today. I find that in the industrial design field. I do not work as an automotive designer, but I work on products, and there's a similar feeling because you're trying to create something that's functional, that's usable in many ways, but is also beautiful, and you're thinking about form. And I am finding that less and less sketching takes place as I move through the design process, and as the design industry gets more and more efficient, there is less need for developing something on a sheet of paper. It might be that you scratch out a thumbnail very, very quickly and you move directly into Photoshop, or you move directly into Illustrator. And I have found joy in other areas of the industrial design field, working on CAD and developing your thoughts into a 3D model that might then get 3D printed and sanding down a prototype model and adding Bondo to it, or sculpting a clay model, or any of these other avenues of industrial design is still creative and is still very, very motivating and joyful. But it is that central, most primitive element, I think, of creation that I absolutely miss. I miss sketching, and I try my best to incorporate it more and more into my design process. But when you're being paid to go quickly, sometimes that just doesn't make sense. And it's not only an efficiency thing. I think as we see technology start to automate creation, that's not only efficiency, but it's also adding to creativity and supplementing and augmenting the creativity that you already create as a designer. But the action that takes place and the thought processing that takes place, it is not the same. It will not replicate that feeling, that incredibly powerful feeling that takes me back to childhood. It just simply won't do. And as technology changes, I may be looking elsewhere for, how do I reach back into that joy? Of course, I'll always be sketching, but how do I do that in a way that it makes sense from a career standpoint and also makes sense from a happiness standpoint? Because that's what I crave. That's what I fell in love with as a designer. A kid that started learning about these masters of the 60s. There will be ways to find that fulfillment, but I do see that there is potential that sketching itself might become less and less important in the design industry. It might become less and less taught in design schools. And it may be less and less understood to future designers and future generations. Why is it important? Well, in my opinion, again, it is reaching that primitive point of creation where you are just a direct translation from brain to pen to paper. So when was the last time that you sketched? If that's what you fell in love with in becoming a designer, go pick up a pen and start sketching. That's what I'm going to do right now.